Hello, my name is Matt Reardon, and thanks for watching this July 5th, Wednesday evening West Weather Update brought to you by Nutrien Ag Solutions. And belated happy July 4th to you all. Thought I'd start today a little bit backwards or reverse in the way we usually go about these videos. Today we're looking at sea surface temperature anomalies to begin, and there's a few things I think competing influences, if you will, when I look at this map in terms of the July forecast going forward. Now the first one is I think in closest proximity to the western U.S. In fact, it's this cold patch or this cold wedge of waters off the west coast of the U.S. We've been watching this, really it feels like for the last 2 months or so. And I'm not going to use a red color. Let me use a cooler color here on the color bar to illustrate this colder wedge of ocean temperatures. Now, we think this is really the negative phase of the Pacific meridional mode, or the negative PMM. I don't think the semantics there are too important. What is important is colder ocean waters, and we think that has influenced the cooler trends we've seen in California, certainly Southern California, the coast of California throughout 2023, running big deficits now on heat units. However you want to measure it, it's been cold there. Perhaps played a role in bringing in some of the upper level troughs and the storminess we saw, certainly to start the year in 2023. We also said going into July, even throughout the summer, that would probably reduce the risks in California specifically, or at least along the coast, of heat waves. And I started saying there's some competing influences here because coming out of this weekend here, the July 4th holiday weekend, we had a brief but impactful heat wave in parts of California, with temperatures soaring into the triple digits, despite this colder patch of ocean waters. So competing influences here, we'll keep an eye on this. There's a few other things here. One is certainly worth mentioning, the developing El Nino out in the Pacific. That has been underway. There's been a bit of a pause in the development of what we'll call El Nino proper. That's the box here in the central tropical Pacific where we really measure El Nino 3.4 as we call it. Nonetheless, water temperatures still warming up across the board in the Pacific. That's probably playing a role in some of the increased warming trend in some of these long-range forecasts, perhaps playing a role as well in the recent heat wave we had here. Nonetheless, it's July. We're going to be talking about heat most years. We get into a July forecast, and then we've also had this warm patch of water building into what we'll call maybe the southern and eastern half of the Gulf of Alaska. And we think this has potentially influenced some of the warmer weather trends we've seen over the last few weeks, maybe even a few months here in parts of the Pacific Northwest. Keep these factors in mind. We'll talk about them kind of repeatedly in the forecast today. I thought I'd start from the National Hurricane Center. One thing I think that's obvious looking at those sea surface temperature anomalies before, if we look in the far eastern Pacific, kind of just off the west coast of Mexico, we see warmer ocean temperatures there. And those warmer ocean temperatures, those kind of the bathwater ocean temperatures, are fuel for hurricanes, tropical storms, and we've seen a fast start to the season, certainly in the eastern Pacific. We just were watching Hurricane Adrian, which reached Category 2 strength before quickly dissipating in the Pacific, and then Beatriz, right behind that, reached Category 1 strength. So both hurricanes there starting off the season in the Pacific. And potentially here, if we look at the National Hurricane Center forecast over the next 7 days, those could be, followed quickly by the next two storms on the list. That would be Calvin, the C name, and the D name would be Dora. And they've identified two areas of interest here in the eastern Pacific, what we can kind of consider this main development area for these eastern Pacific storms. One here off the west coast of Mexico, and then another one just a bit further to the southeast, kind of overlapping that area of concern with potential development behind it. Now, hurricanes, they take quite a while to develop, usually over the course of days, not hours. So we're really looking at these potentially developing over the weekend or even out into next week. If we jump over and look at the infrared satellite picture over that same area of interest in the eastern Pacific, we see quite a bit of thunderstorms. If we look at this infrared satellite imagery, kind of circle this area here, a number of thunderstorms showing up on the satellite imagery, but nothing too organized yet, which is why we don't have a named storm, like a named tropical storm like Calvin or Dora yet. As these thunderstorms kind of coalesce and percolate out there in the Pacific, its likely development will be coming soon. There's a number of different ways we can forecast this or get an idea of what that development might look like. This is a product I like to use from Tropical Tidbits. It's looking at an ensemble. So this is looking at a number of different model runs from the GFS, NOAA's forecast, numerical weather prediction model here. And it takes all these different ensemble members, as we call it, 51 in total, and it looks to see how many of those develop a tropical storm or maybe even a hurricane, and then tries to kind of bin them to show areas of interest out into the forecast. So this is valid as a Thursday morning. No major areas of development here, but as I take this into the weekend, Friday, Saturday, now into Sunday, we can see kind of this heat contour here this color map showing up an area of interest, certainly of development, potentially from a number of these members here just off the west coast of the Pacific. This likely would be Tropical Storm Calvin developing this weekend. And there's quite a bit of agreement from a number of different ensemble members here. And if I take you back to the National Hurricane Center forecast, you notice they're predicting a 70% chance of development over the next 7 days for that area of disturbance. I think that kind of likelihood, that greater than half chance of development, lines up. I think with this forecast here, at least from the GFS, strong agreement among a number of these different model runs that there will be some sort of tropical storm development here in the West Pacific. Now, if we look just behind that to the east, there's potential Dora, the next name on the list, with some weak organization here happening a bit further toward the southeast off the coast of Central America. So I take you through the forecast all the way out into Monday of next week, now into Tuesday. I said these things take a while to develop. We see the potential tropical storm Dora behind that. Now, nothing getting out this far in the forecast is certain, but this is the way the development looks right now, at least taking this GFS model as it stands here today. Now, one thing we did look at in the sea surface temperature map I showed you before is that colder ocean water patch we were just talking about. If we kind of follow this wedge into the eastern Pacific, we can kind of draw this line right to the southwest from the Baja Peninsula, and that gives us an idea, if I draw that same kind of line here, where these hurricanes, if they do develop, are likely going to encounter some very unfriendly water for hurricane development or even maintenance. So if you keep a close eye on this forecast model run, these forecast models certainly assimilate or take into account those ocean temperatures. And if you watch closely at kind of these two contours of member development as they get past that, we'll call it the blue wall, quickly dissipating. We saw a very similar organization and maintenance from Adrian and Beatrice just recently here last week. So not expecting major development as they get further toward the northwest, where they might potentially impact any sort of U.S. impact. Not expecting anything like that at this time. And a big reason why is just those colder ocean temperatures right now that are still present, typically present at this time of the year in June and July anyway. If we kind of fast forward here, looking at things as they stand today as of Wednesday afternoon here, July 5th, not a ton of hazards out from NOAA here looking across the western region. Big kind of newsmakers, I would say we're still seeing the lingering effects from that weekend heat wave. We have heat advisories through the Willamette Valley here, red flag warnings indicating wildfire risk in some of these areas here. Not seeing excessive heat warnings, so while it is warmer, certainly than average, not quite as hot, relatively speaking, as it was, say, in California earlier, but probably certainly feeling like a warm day here in parts of Washington and Oregon. In fact, if we jump over and take this map valid as of Wednesday afternoon here, this is looking at the National Weather Service, the NDFD daytime high temperature forecast as those depart from average. And by doing that, it gives us a sense for where are people feeling temperatures that are warmer than average here, even for July 5th, where the average temperature isn't very cold to begin with. And certainly the heat map here pointing our eyes toward the Willamette Valley of Oregon, as we just discussed, in parts of Washington, extending a bit into eastern Washington as well. Now that's Wednesday afternoon. Another notable piece of information on this map is California, as we talked about last week. Hot over the weekend, but here this week has trended a bit colder, or more seasonal at least, through parts of the Central Valley and certainly the coastline, seeing those colder than average temperatures return. We think, again, the influence of that negative PMM or the cold patch of water off the west coast of the United States. That's a bit easier to say. Now, as I take this into Tuesday and then into Wednesday, you'll notice that heat shifting out of Oregon, or at least the Willamette Valley proper, into eastern Oregon, into parts of eastern Washington, seeing more of those anomalous temperatures. And again, I'll just remark, if you look at some of the values here, we're talking about maybe 10 degrees Fahrenheit above a normal temperature for this time of year. Now, that's going to feel quite warm because normal temperatures getting into early July are quite hot, but we're not expecting, I would think, an excessive heat warning type of situation in eastern Washington, but definitely a warmer day in terms of what we're typically dealt with throughout the year. If I take this into Saturday, you'll look at California, Central Valley, cooler than average. The coastline certainly well below average here. Some of that heat lingering into the Pacific Northwest. Sunday, we start to warm up more across the board. California staying colder than average, but now Arizona, parts of New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, Idaho, getting into those 5 to 10 degrees above normal anomalies. As I take this into Monday and Tuesday, that warmth even expanding more broadly from there to the point now where Idaho, parts of eastern Washington, Oregon, Nevada, more of the Central Valley now, Arizona and New Mexico, dealing with that 5 to 10 degree above average anomaly. So this kind of general warming trend as we get out into next week. We'll note that this is now a 6-day forecast at this point, so nothing too certain in a weather forecast at 6 days. There is some good agreement that we could be seeing a warm-up trend in parts of California and Arizona next week as a departure from this kind of seasonal lull we've been in here in the middle of this week. Now, precipitation over the same time period will take this out the 7 days out into Wednesday of next week. That would be July 12th. Kind of a similar story to last week, not a ton of significant precip really to talk about across the entire region, save for parts of the Front Range or perhaps the mountainous regions in Idaho and western Montana. Now, looking closely at this, it's not too unexpected, I would say. In fact, if I just go ahead and show you the average monthly precipitation across the U.S. in July, we don't get a lot of precipitation in the western U.S. really across the board in July. Anyway, if we kind of look at some of these values here, 1/2 inch is where you kind of get into that orange color here, this kind of beige color, and you really have to get into like light green to even get an inch in the month of July. And that's really saved for maybe some of these areas in the Cascades, the Olympic Mountains, and then the desert southwest monsoon. Now, we talked about that desert southwest monsoon in El Nino years tends to be weakened, if not just delayed outright. And so some of these areas that can get some decent precip in July, as much as 1 to 2, some of these mountainous regions even more than that, aren't seeing as much precip here on the forecast because of what we think is some El Nino influence in the jet stream. Keep that in mind as we kind of go forward into this forecast. This area is seeing a delayed start to the monsoon season. I would include New Mexico, certainly in parts of that as well. Now, this is looking at the upper level heights. We do this to keep track of ridges, troughs, where we might see warmer or drier weather associated with ridges, possibly heat waves as well, troughs being more inclement weather, cooler weather, cold fronts, rain, precipitation. Now, if I make this valid as a Wednesday evening here, big upper level trough, or ridge, I should say, in the Gulf of Alaska, perhaps warming up those ocean temperatures there, have this kind of weak ridging action here over parts of Arizona, California. That's kind of helping drive some of these tropical storms off to the northwest. That steering flow in the upper levels of the atmosphere can push those hurricanes around, and that flow is coming around clockwise around that upper level ridge, and it's kind of just ushering those developing tropical storms off to the west or the northwest right over that blue wall, and that's helping those to dissipate. And we'll keep that in mind too as we talk about this forecast here. As we go out into Thursday, into Friday, no major change. That ridge now to the southeast over Arizona, perhaps weakening or moderating just a bit. If we take this through Friday, no major changes here. That ridge still weakening some. We talked about temperatures kind of moderating over this time period across the west until we got into the weekend proper, Saturday and Sunday. Some of that upper level ridging now that was in the Gulf of Alaska shifting east over British Columbia or Alberta up in Canada. We even see, at least from this forecast here from the 12Z European model, the upper level low remnants, potentially from Beatrice, I believe, actually gets absorbed into the flow here, probably without much effect in terms of California here. But if you're wondering what that little blip was coming on shore in California, that might have been kind of the ghost of Beatrice, if you will, not expecting major precipitation or really much from that. But if we get into Monday here, this is all the way out to July 10th. I'll take this just to Tuesday now, 6-day forecast to July 11th. Well, that upper level ridge kind of steadily through the weekend into Monday now into Tuesday has been strengthening quite a bit here over parts of Arizona, New Mexico, and really expanding even in its influence up in parts of California, Nevada, Utah, Colorado. Now, as I walked through those kind of daytime temperature anomalies a few slides ago, we talked about broader warmth potentially increasing across the west, at least as far as that National Weather Service forecast was concerned. That lines up here, just looking at the ECMWF model, the European Weather Prediction Model, with that upper level ridge developing over parts of Arizona and New Mexico. So seeing some agreement there, that makes sense to me that we could be seeing some warmth more widespread across parts of the west. As far as specific heat wave talk, probably a bit too early, but the potential is there, certainly maybe for parts of the Central Valley of California, certainly the lower Colorado River Valley, parts of Arizona, New Mexico. As this heat builds into the area, we're talking about potentially significantly higher temperatures, even relative to normal. Too early, I think, to talk specifics, but as that ridge develops, that risk is there. If we look at the GFS ensemble, just kind of a different way to get another opinion, a different forecast here, and we see some agreement here. Same kind of developed ridge over parts of Arizona, New Mexico, California, parts of southern Nevada, and Utah. A little bit more kind of smoothed out here because we're looking at an ensemble model, but really looking for an agreement in that pattern. I think we're seeing it here. That increases the chances for heat returning to parts of the west getting out into next week. Again, kind of conflicting with the start of this video. I talked about that cold patch of ocean water off the coast of California we thought would be influencing a reduced risk of heat waves, at least kind of in that immediate coastline or Central Valley part of California. I don't think that's necessarily gone. We could be seeing a building up of another brief heat wave getting out into mid next week, and it's possible by the end of next week or going into next weekend, we're talking about a similar situation like we are now, where temperatures are quickly coming back down or at least getting more seasonal. We'll just have to keep an eye on that as we go through next week. I did want to point one thing out. You're looking at a forecast here. This is from the ECMWF as well, of precipitable water. And this is kind of a neat value to see forecasted out into the future here. Precipitable water, really just a measure of kind of the absolute amount of moisture in the atmosphere, at least in the lower level of the lowest level of the atmosphere we care about in terms of weather. And we call it precipitable water because it's all the water that could potentially be wrung out of the atmosphere. And you just think of, are we getting moist air into the area or not? And this is actually looking at relative to normal. So we can see it kind of relative to where we're at in July. Now, if I start this here as Wednesday evening, just pretty dry air relative to average over parts of California, Arizona, and New Mexico. This is, I think, associated with the delayed start to our monsoon season. And I'll quickly take this forecast out rather quickly. Thursday, Friday, see we're still lingering that dry air over parts of Arizona and New Mexico. But as we get into Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, we can see some shifts here. One, we have a potential hurricane developing down in the western part of New Mexico. If this ECMWF forecast run is to be believed, that likely being Calvin, developing into a pretty significant hurricane, I would say, well offshore, fortunately. But the moisture plume from that hurricane and this ridge developing over Arizona and New Mexico, potentially allowing some more Pacific moisture, to push up into the area. And if we have those hot daytime temperatures building into parts of Arizona and New Mexico, getting into the middle of next week, we could finally see some precip from what is getting into our monsoon season. Now, not expecting anything too significant at this time, hard to talk specifics a week out, but potentially kind of on the southern end of the desert southwest part of the United States here, at least seeing some more normal precipitation, or precipitable water, I should say, returning to the area in what has been a delayed start here in the earliest part of our monsoon season. And sometimes these hurricanes can bring in these moisture plumes from the eastern Pacific, where there is quite a bit of moisture anyway this time of year, and it can help to bring in potential rain chances where there otherwise wouldn't be. So that's one reason we watch these hurricanes, even though we're not necessarily expecting any direct impact. The other reason, I'll be honest, we watch them is because, frankly, they're cool from a meteorological perspective, looking at the infrared or the satellite imagery, seeing how they develop. It's always neat to see those images, especially with what we'll call these fish storms, which head out to sea and don't affect any life or property other than stirring up a few fish out there in the Pacific. Last thing I want to look at the Climate Prediction Center. So this is NOAA's Climate Prediction Center, or CPC as we occasionally call it. Their forecast for the 6 to 10 day outlook, this is essentially looking out into the work week of next week. If you look at their temperature forecast, we see that developing ridge over parts of Arizona and New Mexico really kind of sneaking over from Texas. We talked about that developing and that forecast there, so they're in agreement. Drier weather expected across the interior west associated with that. But if we look closer, and this is getting pretty nitpicky, at the far southern end of the desert southwest, finally starting to see perhaps a return to more normal precipitation, maybe on the far southern end of Arizona here. And if you remember, I showed you some of those July kind of normal precip plots. Normal precip in southern Arizona in July, we start to see the influence of that monsoon, where we might be talking about a ½ inch per week of rainfall, usually in the form of thunderstorms. So potentially seeing kind of a slow but meaningful start to the monsoon season here in the desert southwest. If we look to the 8 to 14 day outlook, so this is looking all the way through next weekend, all the way out to July 19th now, more of the same. Heat, again, kind of entrenched across Arizona and New Mexico, I think building into the Central Valley at times. We'll see if that's more of a brief heat wave or something more long-lasting. I lean toward the former, just with those cooler waters hanging off the Pacific coast of the U.S. there. But again, that near normal or normal precipitation value sneaking into parts of southern Arizona. Perhaps a hint that the delayed start to the monsoon season may be getting going here as we get into the end of July, and we'll see what August holds. That's all I have for you all this evening. Thank you for watching.